But I can remember driving to school one day and there was this lorry coming towards me, and I remember asking myself whether it wouldn't be a good idea to drive the car straight into the front of the lorry. By that time, I suppose I really wasn't functioning at all. And I remember going into the headmaster's room and sort of crying all over him and but he didn't understand at all, you know.
I just wasn't functioning at all, and I did think, what have I got to do to make somebody listen, to help me? It was very scary, very frightening.
I was having horrendous nightmares, and they were all work-related. You feel absolutely awful, to the extent that you do feel suicidal. I mean, there was more than one occasion that I did contemplate suicide, because you're just in despair that you will ever get any better.
It is claimed that 1 in 3 teachers will have mental health problems at some time during their career. The subject of mental illness remains a taboo, but some have been willing to break the silence. Chris Daines left his post as a deputy head teacher as a result of mental illness. Chris has manic depression, also known as bipolar disorder.
I was at Oxford doing a DPhil, and I had my first phase of really acute mental illness. And in those days, the university didn't really have any support mechanisms. So I left the university, very sadly, and I didn't have anything to do after I recuperated with my parents. And I saw this job in the Times Educational Supplement. I'd always told myself that teaching was the very last resort, which is an irony, because of course actually I did rather well until I had my final illness. I went in as acting head of department, and I have to say that within 18 months of my arrival, we managed to get the standards up so that the department was the best department in the school academically, which I was very proud of.
You're more or less due east there.
The specific incident that led to my final illness, and what it was a very tricky situation where we had a boy who was quite clearly very, very disturbed. I handled it very, very badly. We are not social workers, you know. We are not psychiatrists. I mean, maybe that's the guilt of the disease talking. I mean, maybe if anybody, you know, could have bished up like I did, but, you know, other people are able to bish up and carry on, but because I bished up and I'm a depressive, it, you know, made me fall apart. The strains of having to cope with that kind of stuff when one's got issues in one's own life as well, really can put for people over the edge. And of course it ended up with my first marriage going down the toilet, you know. I would use the word obsessed with the idea that I had failed, that my life had been one series of failures after another, that this had been due to my own fault, and that the whole business of depression was a kind of medical lie which was used by medics who basically didn't want to be proper medics in order to cover up the fact that people like me are just wicked.
Mental illness remains misunderstood, and those who have never been affected by it often struggle when dealing with it.
My other deputy would ring her saying, he's got to get back to school, you know, you can't bring your personal problems into the classroom. and all of that sort of thing. And it really wasn't until 6 months afterwards, when I was finally told that there was no chance of me going back to work, that I had, I think, one visit from a member of staff. And these were people who I had had round my house, were close personal friends, as well as being colleagues. And you know, that's pretty nasty. It's pretty nasty stuff. But hey, you know, out of sight, out of mind. I mean, I think that would be a really nice thing to do. When I met Ruth, really, she was just a mate in the pub. I was very ill and the marriage split up, and I was kind of, for a couple of nights, sleeping in the car. I mean, I really reached rock bottom. And it was Ruth who sort of scraped me off the floor with a spatula and took me to mental hospital. There's no doubt in my mind that if it were not for Ruth, I would have been dead. I mean, simple as that.
I don't think I was aware of the extent of the illness. I think we're still learning things about it. He went from being a real high-flying person to doing absolutely nothing and feeling emasculated, undignified, misunderstood and humiliated. This is my seat. Thank you. Ooh. Hello, Paddy.
I'm angry with the disease because it robbed me of a good career twice. Once an academic career and then again a teaching career. I'm angry, but there's no point because it's gone. And there's no point thinking, oh, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a teacher, because I can't.
The 2006 National Union of Teachers Conference brought the issue of mental illness to the forefront in a speech given by the former President John Illingworth.
Thank you, President. Conference. I'm not the only person in this hall with a mental illness. Probably a third of you and a third of our members will experience mental illness at some time. I wasn't open enough about it at the time, but it was the cause of my standing down from the General Secretary election 2.5 years ago. My illness has been caused, by the cumulative stress of work over many years.
John, just take a sip of water and take your time. And don't worry about timing. I hope conference agrees.
Thank you. My illness was caused by cumulative stress over the years, which became beyond my capacity to manage. I'm removing the cause of stress by leaving teaching. I think I've been a good head and a good teacher, but for me, enough's enough. They've seen me off. My health comes first. Don't carry this for me. Do it for the others, so they're not like me. One of the things that happens when you are, I suppose, having a breakdown or, severe anxiety and depression is you find you can't relate to people as you were able to beforehand. You find you can't make decisions. You find you become irritable and obsessive. You find you're spending your time dealing with trivial things instead of important things. So what I was getting to the stage where I really couldn't interact appropriately, and I had a very difficult kind of conflict with a parent, and came close, I think, to physical violence, and knew that I just wasn't fit to be there. and that was what I think sent me over the edge. And that was the spark that made me realise I was actually quite dangerous being in charge of a school. And so I left on that day expecting to take a little bit of time off, and I've never been back. When I left school, I lived almost like a recluse for weeks after that. You are very depressed, you feel very guilty about the fact you're not at work, but you're not all that rational about why you're doing things. You're not in a fit state, actually, to make any sensible decisions. There is a culture out there, and I think I was part of it, historically, that is pull yourself together, get a grip. And if you haven't lived through it, if you haven't experienced it, it is very hard indeed to explain exactly what it is like. I didn't tell people that I was suffering from depression and anxiety because you're secretive about it, because you think, if you tell everybody about this, it's going to affect your future. And you're right to think that, because for a lot of teachers, it will if they're open about it. So it's a real difficult tightrope to walk, really, to look for help, but you don't want to admit that you've got a serious problem, because in our society nowadays, lunch is for wimps and so on. If you're not working round the clock and being good at everything, there's a judgment of you being a failure. One of the few symptoms I have remaining is that I struggle to go into any primary school. So, and I really have trouble going past one when, when the children are on the playground playing, and I can't drive easily on a road in Nottingham that is part of the route that I used to drive to work. So if I'm going somewhere completely different, but I'm going on similar roads, I get a feeling that's hard to describe. It's a bit like vertigo. I can actually be physically sick, the thought of going really into a school. If I had to go back to be the job of a head teacher tomorrow, I'd be in serious trouble. I know I would. I'm going to Stevenage in Hertfordshire to talk to a group of teachers there about the work I've been doing. And you can be fairly certain in any meeting I go to, there'll be groups of teachers who've experienced illness or are worried about their mental health. If somebody had told me that I'd be spending my time going around the country talking about mental illness amongst teachers, I would have told them they were totally crazy. And I actually wouldn't have believed 15 years ago that it was an issue of importance, because 15 years ago I knew of very, very few teachers with problems of stress and depression that were related to their work. Sadly, every year now I know there are more and more cases. So it is a growing problem. We surveyed a random sample of a third of our members. More than 70% said the increased amount of monitoring, data collection, accountability was increasing their stress levels. You need to get into your schools and say to the head teacher, here are these management standards. What are we doing in this school to fulfill it? Do you know how many hours your teachers are working? Do you know how they're feeling? If schools are not proactive and they leave it to teachers to raise these things, which is incredibly difficult for individuals, they won't. Teachers won't. They'll drive themselves on until they have a breakdown, and when you have a serious breakdown like I had, your chances of getting back into teaching is very slim indeed. Most psychiatrists will tell you a full-blown breakdown will take 5 years to recover from. No school is going to hold your post open for 5 years while you recover. But don't believe it's just a handful of teachers that aren't coping. This is an issue for the whole profession. This isn't just something that happens to old teachers like me. People are being driven out of teaching in their 20s by mental illness, 30s, 40s, 50s. being forced to leave teaching is almost like a bereavement for people, and they spend the rest of their life seeing themselves, perceiving themselves as being failures. And, you know, that goes on to perpetuate their illness. And one of the saddest things about all of this is actually it's some of the very most conscientious, hard-working teachers who get themselves into these circumstances. Then you can get drawn in to just going on and on and on to the state where you never do anything but work or think about work or feel guilty about work or worry about work. And those are the people then that end up in trouble. And, you know, take their job away from them, saying you're not fit to do this anymore. That's just another blow on top of all of that. And, you know, it's absolutely tragic what it does to some people.
Carole Dimmock believes that the pressures of her job as a primary school teacher were the catalyst for her being admitted to hospital with a mental health problem.
I was teaching for 7 years, and then I had 7 years off, and then I went back and I did 11 years supply teaching. I worked in more than 30 different schools, all in the south of the borough, the London Borough of Hillingdon, and it was just an amazing experience. I must have literally taught thousands of children. And I applied for a 4-day week job, but they said that a teacher was off sick and would I take a reception class. So I did, but as I realise now, that was a bit of a mistake, taking on full-time when I'd previously only been part-time. At the point I became unwell was that I was working full-time, and with the national curriculum in place, there was an enormous amount of stress involved in all the planning. It was a total nightmare, let alone the teaching and the long days. I was almost working 7 days a week. No time to go to the theatre or anything like that. Go out for a meal and not even be able to talk to my husband. And I was thinking, this is not right. This is just wrong. But there seemed to be no way out. And I was overworking, but I was also being criticised. So my self-esteem I was all mixed up. I was supposed to attend this meeting, and my husband in the end took me to the school, and I cracked up before it. I was off sick then for quite a few months, and I just got worse and worse and worse. You think I'm going mad? I don't know. I couldn't cope with the supermarket because you have to make choices. You can't choose if you're severely depressed, which I was. I made numerous visits to my GP, and he said, we need to get you into hospital, but it was like, I don't know how we're going to get you. You know, it sounded like you've got to climb a mountain to get into hospital, because they only take acute patients. And I'm thinking, well, if I hadn't tried to commit suicide, I'd been asked about it, and I said I'd never even thought about it. But it wasn't on my agenda at all. That wasn't it. I wanted to get better. It was that those few months were so frightening, because I was just going down and down and down. And it was just so scary.
Carole was finally admitted to a specialist mental health unit.
Hardly anyone visited me in hospital. My husband came every day. they ought to be there. People ought to be there, at least to listen and to hold somebody's hand and try to be supportive. Maybe they're frightened that they'll become ill as well. There's lots of fears around mental health.
Since leaving hospital, Carole has decided to dedicate her time to helping others who are affected by mental illness. She now volunteers at the hospital running a coffee afternoon for the patients.
I just love being at the hospital. I love being with the people. I never come away thinking that was a waste of time.
Yeah. Fancy a cup of coffee?
Yes, that sounds a really nice idea.
Yeah,
We'll have one before people come.
talking to people. That's what I enjoy the most. What do you enjoy the most?
Yes, I think it is. It's they really appreciate the fact that we're doing it, and that we've all been unwell ourselves. And as you said, it's the talking to the people, and actually seeing them moving on. And then we'll come one week, and you'll find I'll be able to say to Lucia, "Oh, so and so's gone home," and you'll think, "Oh, they're moving on," you know.
Mind you, I don't think anyone does commit herself as much as you. Whenever someone is in need, you're there. So.
I'm there.
Yes, so I think.
And I've said it many times over the years since I was in hospital, that it was a blessing in disguise. It really was. That Carole at 50 became ill, and then I think of what I'm doing now. I would never have believed that I could be doing what I'm doing now, and loving it.
Michelle Coleman is deputy head of a special school in Surrey. The school supported her during her time off work with stress, and she has since been able to return.
We all learn from experience, and over the years I've seen a lot of people either with breakdowns or time off with stress, and even though I recognise that, because that's one of the things that I know that I'm quite good at, and I recognise it, but it wasn't until perhaps it also happened to me that I began to really feel what it's like. It hasn't always been roses, and we've had to work at it, and we do need to put time in to help staff come through it, advise them, take time out, just making them feel that it's okay.
The school employs Brian Phelps as a therapeutic consultant for the pupils, and has found that his therapy is needed just as much by the staff.
It's actually quite draining most of the time, because it is constant with him.
So what is it that we could do to actually put that together, really, that it's more of a group ownership or a school ownership of this problem?
I think with children...
It needs to be recognised that teachers do actually need to be made available a space or a time to offload or just to talk. I think there's a growing awareness of this need. If we look at some of the stress levels out there within teachers, I think it's slow, but I think it is happening. There is more and more recognition of the need, and I think hopefully in time, if we can actually recognise the fact that the impact on teachers and their stress levels will affect their performance.
The guilt of taking that time off was actually very hard. Very, very hard, but I knew that I was not going to be any good in school, and that I would begin to make mistakes, which I was already doing. I recognised it, but thankfully with Brian there, who also had worked alongside and was seeing what was happening and knew sort of, hang on a second, you're under huge pressure here, that I did take the time off. I was told by my doctor, you need to take time out, you need to go away, you need to be away from the whole situation. That was still hard. I kept wondering what was going on. How are they doing and what's happening in school? And actually after a while then I began to really totally relax and totally just think about me and getting myself back, you know, back up to, you know, up to par, up to scale as to how, you know, I've always been. But yes, you have this, because you're go, go, go all the time, it's all of a sudden stopped. But it was needed. It was very needed, very much needed. Quite often I think when teachers or anybody's out ill or on stress, you begin to feel very isolated. And I was very lucky that some of the key staff who I knew, they'd phone up or they'd, you know, just say, hope you're okay, or just to let you know that we're thinking of you. And that actually kept you in touch, because you begin to feel so isolated. So that's also another, you know, another aspect that's important. You had a NUT sort of said, no, you're doing this, you're going to go back, I probably would not have stepped foot back into a school again. So it was important that I did that. And I knew when I came back that I'd missed it so much, and it was really felt so good to be back. So I knew I'd done the right thing. But I think by talking about it now, I just hope that other people can sort of say, well, oh right, you know, well, I'm not on my own then, or it's actually okay for that to happen. And it is.